Welcome back to Prepared to Prevail, where our goal is to bring you helpful and actionable information from industry professionals that help you on your journey to daily preparedness and an upgraded level of capability. Today I'm joined by Wade Poland. Thank you, Wade, for being here. If you could please introduce yourself, tell us your background and what it is you do, done, and then we'll get diving in here to some super important conversations about mindset and things in society, stuff like that. But first, could you tell us about yourself, your background, and some of your interests and why behind what you do and why?
Well, thank you, Trevor, and thanks for the opportunity to be on here and to share a little bit. I guess I look at everything in my life as kind of an evolution of, I'll kind of give an introduction like I would in the beginning of our concealed pistol license classes that, I grew up in the small town of Middleville. And why that's important is I grew up with some very strong family values of respect for, my parents, for my community, for law enforcement, for military, for elders in general, respect for everybody or mutual respect. And that being said, my dad raised me hunting and fishing and taught me firearm safety from a very young age. And everything's kind of evolved for me over the years. I left high school and went in the military. So I spent 4 years in the Navy. I was part of Desert Storm and got out of the military, started a family, and that kind of led me down the path of self-defense and firearms instruction and reserve law enforcement. So I was part of reserve law enforcement at a couple different agencies and really had a passion for that. Uh, Along those lines, there was also some struggles that led me to start Trinity Training and Security in 2017. So I started that where we obviously did a lot of firearms training, self-defense type training, became a federal firearms licensed dealer, licensed security for the state of Michigan. And I've always kind of had the philosophy of, I can do anything if I put my mind to it. And I don't like to rely on others, which is another philosophy you and I've talked a lot about, is be your family's first responder. I don't like to rely on other people. So I like to be very self-sufficient in all aspects of my life if possible. So I'm sure we may talk a little bit more about my transition out of Trinity Training and Security that Trevor now owns, and what a blessing that's probably been for you and been for me, and allowed me to try and maintain that warrior mindset and that self-sufficient that mindset, but also to kind of wind down from the business and things that we were very involved with for a very long time. So along the way, like a lot of different things, mixed martial artists. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, awesome. A lot of things there, and that's always been a theme with you, is you're a super busy guy. For those that are listening and watching, Wade and I have known each other for quite a while, as he alluded to there, and involved with Trinity and business wise, and also as a personal dear friend and mentor, and a lot of things. So I can't say enough how excited I am to have you on, especially as we're launching this show and everything. I'm super excited for it, and I actually want to dive right into what you said kind of right off the rip there on raised with family values and respect. And I was actually thinking we would dive into something else first, but with the family values and respect and things you were raised with, and things you probably learned along the way too through growing up and MMA and going into the Navy and all these things. What are some of those like key values and concepts? And then we'll kind of talk about where we see them in society too.
Yeah. Um, I think I was always learning from my dad. I think he was a very intelligent guy too, a very good heart. But once again, going back to those family values that he was raised with that were passed along to me, and then I tried to pass along to my kids, and hopefully they'll pass them along to my grandkids. Things are kind of generational when we talk about the things that you learn from the people that you care about in your life. One of those examples that I give is as a young kid who goes to school, we'll say elementary school, you know, I guess Bullying is something that you hear a lot about these days. Well, bullying has been going on, even I'm 57 years old. So, 50 years ago, when I was probably in second or third grade, bullying was a thing back then. But my dad made things very clear to me. He said, I have the right to go to school and to learn at school and play on the playground and do all of the things that a 7-year-old should and not be bullied. And my dad said that, if I was bullied, I had his permission to resolve that problem with whatever means necessary so that I didn't continue to be bullied. And, I he took it even one step further to say he made it very clear that if I was ever the bully, I was going to pay the price when I got home. So it kind of the root of those values of be a good person. And I just I thought of that if I was ever on the playground as a kid and I saw somebody who was less fortunate than me or a different skin color than me or anything else, my reaction was not always to bully that person. It was how can I make friends with that person and how can they be an ally of me? Because I fully well knew if I didn't treat that person with respect and my dad ever found out about it, I had the fear of God in my dad from my dad. You know, he didn't abuse me in any way, but he disciplined. And so, like I said, fast forward now, that's just one of those little lessons that he taught me. And as we go through society today, we all have the right to go to work, go to school, go anywhere without being bullied. And when I look at some of the things that go on in this world today, it's bullying at an adult level. So yeah,
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, especially when you said bullying at an adult level, and we see that so much on, I'm gonna push my way by any means necessary, not to coin what you said there, but similar mentality, but for the wrong reasons. And that's kind of the first thing I want to dive into is you've always been the type of guy in my eyes that does the right things for the right reasons consistently day in, day out for the long haul.
thanks, Trevor.
That's absolutely. And thank you for doing that and being such a role model. And we need more of those. And that's kind of what I'm getting at too, is not to get super cynical right off the bat here, but have you seen over, you said 57, I wasn't going to drop age there, but a couple different angles here over your life, obviously more life experience than myself. And then you've also, I won't give away your locations, but you've moved from a state to another and you've lived in other states and things like that. So are there things that you see generationally, geographically, or just over the course of a longer life than mine where you see, is that a do we have a culture of doing the right things for the right reasons? I guess I don't wanna focus too hard on the negatives because it's very easy to do, but, like, how do we impact that? What can we do and how? Because going back to my view of you as being somebody who's always done that, and I've seen that influence others, and you've mentored so many people, and I see that huge impact, and so what are some pro tips, if you will, on how we can all integrate that and encourage that, and even a picture of what we see and how we almost combat it, if you will? What's kind of your take on some of that? I know that was a bit of a lot there.
Yeah, no, first of all, at 57 years old, I still don't have it all figured out. I'm always learning, I'm always evolving. And, business philosophy of mine was always I know I've told you along the way, if something works, continue to do what works, but always look for ways to improve. But caveat there, if something doesn't work, you have to figure it out immediately and you have to correct it. So many people will just go through the silly, really analogy that I used to use all of the time. It's just people will do the same thing. I'll use this other example. I used to teach a lot of classes to one of the largest employers in the United States. It was a 3-day class that I taught. I won't tell you the employer or what the class was, but there was always 8 people in this class. And when we did the introductions for those people in the class, they'd introduce themselves. I'd tell them about me and who I am. And then I would ask them, hey, you're going to spend 3 days with me. I want you to write down, take a blank sheet of paper and write down one thing that you hope to get out of this class in 3 days. So one, it's going to force them to kind of think about, well, what do I want out of these 3 days with and then it's also going to help me realize what their expectations are so that I can properly meet those expectations. Um, that's a little training tip there. But one of the point I really wanted to make with that was that 8 people in that class, always 8 people, and I didn't want their name on the piece of paper. Just write one thing that you want out of this class at 3 days. Well, as they're scribbling on that piece of paper, when the very first person finished, if that first person took that piece of paper and folded it in half and gave it to me, every single person in that class folded that piece of paper and gave it to me. And if that first person that finished didn't fold the piece of paper and just handed it to me, nobody folded the piece of paper and handed it to me. So, I really started to learn a lot about people there and how people are followers. They're going to do what other people do. They're going to watch their neighbors, they're going to watch people, and what's rewarded is repeated. And so you look at what we talk a little bit about societal shift over the years is that I have seen a decline in respect for authority, particularly law enforcement and military of all different facets. And, of course, it's our First Amendment right to free speech and people can voice their opinion. But the point that people miss most of the time is that you have that right to free speech, but it doesn't mean that there aren't adverse consequences to what you did. So yeah, you have the right to do and say whatever, or not do, but the right to say whatever you want, and protected by that First Amendment right. But it doesn't mean there can't be any consequences. And yeah, I just see a big societal shift of people now when things are publicized where people are protesting or doing whatever, it's like that people folding that piece of paper and handing it to me, because when people see that, everybody else is going to follow and say, well, they did this and they got away with that and I want to do it and it's my right. I can do this. And it's just really sad these days. So I don't know if I answered your question totally. They're kind of probably in a roundabout way.
Nope, and that's how I think too, and I think we both think that way sometimes where it's cyclical. We start here and we come there and we come back but you definitely did. And the piece of paper thing is I love that a lot because that's to me a perfect example of human behavior on just like you said, where if one folds it, the rest will. If they don't, they won't. And you see that play out in so many things from schools people choose, jobs people choose, even just bringing it back into, prepared to prevail context of a lot of the things we talk about on the show and things we do work wise. If you get a new flashlight, all of a sudden I'm interested in that flashlight. Or if I get a little flashlight for a vest or whatever, maybe you're interested in it. And even we see that with gear and gadgets, bigger decisions like jobs and even the where you typically see a lot of almost, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like a family business where what the mom or the dad do, a lot of times the kids will follow similar tracks. And then you see that within friend groups and neighborhoods and that collective birds of a feather. I don't really want to call it mob mentality, but that almost tribalness, if you will, seems to be a huge part of human behavior. What you see is what you'll do. Monkey see, monkey do, to bring it back to fifth grade or whatever.
Sure. Well, I do want to circle back to that, to your original question, because I kind of probably got off track and missed my original thought, because you asked, about being a mentor, how I continue to, you know, be positive and be a mentor to people. And I guess first of all, I want to say too, I'm not perfect. As I mentioned, I'm always learning. I fall short sometimes, but I do always have a desire to do the right thing. And it starts with God too. It really does for me. I fall short there a lot too, but I am a very faithful person. I always have been. And I, faithfully have to get up in the morning, and many times there's business or work aspects that are cluttering my mind. I've got to get this done or that done. But I try and start every day with prayer, and I start every day with reading the Bible. and then I can start my work day. And some days that's really hard for me because I'm thinking, I know these tasks and these things I have to do, but no, I've got to put God first in there. And part of my prayer is that I pray every day and I say, God, that you have given me God given talents. And I believe that. We have people who are all different things in this world. Some people are artists. I can't draw to save my life.
Me neither.
And that's where, anybody who denies that there was a creator, I don't know how they can think. We all have different talents. And I say that prayer every day. I say, God, you have given me some very unique talents, but help me to use that for the good of you and help me be a light to others. Help me to be that positive influence for people. So when they look at me, know that first of all, I'm not perfect, but I want what he has in the way of being a good person. I wanna fold that piece of paper because I see him folding that piece of paper and it's doing really, really good things in life. Back when I did run Trinity, just my wife Lori and I, and we did security and we owned the gym and we had a lot of different businesses and a lot of different things. We also had a core group of people that I felt like they would ask, "Where do you go to church?" And suddenly they would show up at the same church because they want to follow that light. And that's where I pray and I say, "It's not me. I'm not special. My power comes from that higher being of God, and He's made the light in me." So, um,
Yeah, that's the core of it all is where I again completely agree that that's where it all starts is the deep grounding and core of it all. Not to relate faith and the deep why of things to fitness, but it just reminds me when I say like the core of it all, it reminds me of any sport, any athlete, whatever you get into, it almost inevitably comes back to somebody says something to the effect of core strength. And it's all about your core strength and this and that. And to me, it's almost a
and
similar
mental strength.
concept where just like your physical activity relies a lot on your core strength, your mental and your spiritual and how you live in the world and how you treat people and the impact you have on it and the legacy you leave, it really all comes back to that why you were doing it in the first place and those strong convictions. That's my opinion. I don't want to interject that on you, but it sounds like similar opinion.
Yeah, and like I said, there's days when I fall short, and I'm not gonna lie either. This transition of not owning Trinity and not owning the gym and living a little bit of a slower lifestyle is difficult because I have to add to my prayer nowadays and say, I still have those talents that you gave me, God, and I still want to be a light for you, but you're just going to use me in different ways now. So I'm open. Lead me where you want me to go, and I'll try and listen and try and go.
And that's always amazing where that leads sometime. In faith say, I'll do it. I don't know what it is, but I'll do it. I would imagine it's one of those things. Typically, you look back on it and you're like, oh, that's what it was. And, you know, he knows, but we just don't.
Yeah. And there's
Yeah.
never been, I've had bad things happen to me over the years too. Been through a lot of difficult times and like I said, had bad things. And sometimes you just wonder why these things happen and how am I ever going to overcome this? And 20 years later, 30 years later, or whatever, I look back at that and I say, I know the piece that played in the puzzle to get me to where I am today, and there was a reason for it. I struggled through it. I had a difficult time, and I didn't understand at the time, but I can look back now. There's not a single bad thing that's really happened to me ever that I look and say, there was good that came out of that down the road. There was reasons why those things happened.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. There's reasons for everything. Nothing just shows up, a random big boom or just happens. Everything's always connected. And a part of that connectedness is, like you alluded to earlier with well, outright said it with your dad, and we're talking about now with submission to authority, and that all intersects, and that's all a part of that living well and impacting others and positive influence on the world. I think that's a huge piece of that. Faith is probably the biggest piece, and then, another core component of that, in my opinion, is respect for authority and submission to leadership. Let's kind of dive into that a little bit. We'll peel back some layers on the onion here, but first of all, if you could kind of talk to some of your take on submission to authority and leadership. And I know you mentioned your dad and your upbringing, and in the Navy, I would imagine you had some submission to leadership and some people telling you what to do and you got to do it. So if you could open the can of worms on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it all comes down to respect. Again, is that you have to respect authority in, like you said, my dad or the military. I might not have always liked the orders that I got, both growing up from my dad or in the military. There's many times I did a lot of things that I didn't really want to do, but I felt like I signed on that line when I joined the military. I had to do it,
Hey,
and I've got to do it for the period of time. But it's respect for those in charge, respect for law enforcement, respect for our country. I'm a very patriotic person, and I purposely wore this hat. And I'll tell you a little story with that hat. I'm not a big hat guy. I don't always wear a hat. I do have some hair underneath there,
more than me.
but I have some friends in the new community that I live in here, not to go into great detail with them, but they are immigrants from another country. They've been in this country. The wife has been here about 20 years. The husband has been here about 28 years. They're now retired. And not only are they good people, but these people love America. They love our country. And they gave me this hat for my birthday last week. It's 250, United States 250 years this year. And it'll bring tears to my eyes to talk to you about our country. And if everybody could see the love for this country that those people who immigrated from a communist country and did it the right way, love this country. And now they see all of the things that we do on the news. So, they know that not everything is all sunshine and rainbows in this country and in this world right now. But hands down, and we've had discussions over beers where I've seen the tears in their eyes when they said people do not understand what a socialist communist country is and what it does. It's incredible. Um, so it just, once again, it's respect. They, I purposely kind of thought of it last night when I knew I was going to be on this podcast. I told Laura, I said, I'm going to wear this hat and I'm going to talk about these friends because they're the epitome of how it's done the right way. You go through the correct processes, you come in this country, you become a citizen of this country, and then once you're here, you love it and you respect it. You don't go out and do some of the things that are being done in this world and say, "Oh, that's my right." It's just a crazy world we live in.
Yeah, and I thanks for bringing that up too, because that's stories like that always paint a huge picture for me of respect. That, and then when I think the obvious kind of thought, at least in my mind, is usually going to, why do they have such a deep level of respect and appreciation? And my always internal thought is because they actually understand, they actually get it. And this isn't to throw stones at somebody up the road, but I've asked the question in classes and just in conversation, what's the hardest thing you've ever done? And I've been told picking out a college, deciding different things. I won't pick on a bunch of topics and cut anybody to their core on that, but like that, your friends, they truly deeply understand what they have and they're grateful for it and they respect it, and it's almost that theory of when I bought my first car, I treated it a certain way, and I I'd like to think I would have treated a gifted car the same, but that's one of those classic examples. If you pay for it and it's yours and you have some type of sacrifice tied to that thing, it's almost like there's a deeper level of respect and appreciation. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask is where I guess where does that go? Like why are we, at least in my mind, and correct me if I'm completely off course here, but why does it seem like almost some people just don't understand what we have here, because we really do. We have it. We have our issues. Every place does. Every family does. Every community, every country has its problems. But there is absolutely no doubt that this is the best place on earth. And so why it's kind of a twofer. Like why why do you think that's do people just not understand? And then how does that change? And how has that changed in your experience? Like what are some of your thoughts on that?
So many things, on so many different levels that I could share, so many things that just jumped into my mind when we were saying that about, why are things the way they are nowadays? And I guess so a couple things to jump in. One would be vote. Everybody make sure you're registered to vote. Get out there and vote. That is our voice. That's how things change. But don't just vote. Pay attention to who you're voting for and what their values are and what their beliefs are. So many times in election cycles in my lifetime, I've seen examples of, I'm going to vote one way, and there's other people who I'm friends with, whatever they say, oh, I'm going to vote this way. And we'll say, okay, that's your right. Go ahead and do that. But my education told me that I should vote this way. And they're like, no, 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 this is what I'm going to do. And many, 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 many times after the fact, when this side wins or this law, bill, whatever is passed, and things change, then I have those people saying, well, I didn't know it was going to be that way. And that's why I try and say, well, I did. That's why I did my research on the forefront and I knew it was going to be that way. That's why I voted this way. And like I said, so many times, I don't want to jump into subject specific things. That's not my point with it. But, um, you know, do your research and vote with knowledge, not with emotion.
Mhm.
There's many, many things that we can talk politics about where we can talk about emotion and intelligence and try and vote with intelligence, not emotion. Because when you draw emotion into anything, you usually don't make the correct decision. So the other point with that in a societal shift is just that, what's rewarded is repeated. And I mentioned that earlier, but like I said, when everybody sees somebody fold that piece of paper and hand it in, they want to do this, and they're gonna when they see, suddenly they're on the news or they're on TV, and it's a snowball effect, if you will. I'll kind of go back, I guess. I was always trying not to necessarily name names and do things, but it's a political turning point to me too. When Colin Kaepernick, which I'm sorry, if anybody that doesn't know him, he was a former NFL player, and in light of social justice or social injustice or racial injustice, whatever you want to call it, he decided that during our national anthem, he was going to take a knee because he had a platform on national TV to do so. And, I can respect his First Amendment right, and I can respect his knowledge of wanting to do something, but I don't agree with his platform to do it. And here's kind of the reason why. And I told my wife, when that happened too, I said, you watch. So I guess I'll back up and say, I believe it is his right, but we'll talk again, as I've mentioned it many times in here. Even though something is your right and you're allowed to do that, it doesn't mean that there isn't any consequences.
Mhm.
In my opinion, the NFL, his team, They should have all just simply said, hey, that's your right. And we're kudos to you for standing up for what you believe in. But we're going to fine you X amount of dollars and you're not going to play for X amount of games. That's the consequences of using that platform to not respect our flag and our country. And then it probably would have stopped at that point in time because Colin Kaepernick probably would have, and if he did it again, he was fined again, he was benched again. If he did it again, he was fined more and benched more. Eventually, it's going to stop. But what happens is the opposite of that. When there is no consequences necessarily to his actions, and he's allowed to continue that platform, and then it's publicized on every news station, it's publicized on every Sunday football game, it's spread out there in such a wide view, then others, what they did was they saw Colin fold that piece of paper and they said, I'm going to do the same thing. And, some might argue the fact that, well, that's how things change. I don't disagree with that, but there's other ways to get change, the things changed that you want to change. This created a deeper problem. And I think that's where a lot of those problems start. Um, so to my point there, I told my wife at that point in time I was really saddened. One, because I have a great love for this country and great love for God and all of those things that we talked about. And I was really saddened that a person would kneel and not respect that. If you want your platform, take your platform. Just don't disrespect my country. Don't disrespect my flag and the national anthem. And when it was allowed to continue, I told my wife, I said, you watch. I'm so saddened because I said it's going to trickle down. It's going to go to college football. It's going to go to other teams, which it happened. Other teams did the same, or other players on other teams did the same. It went down to the college level. I said it's going to go down to high school. It's going to go down to little league football. Now you've got maybe a 10-year-old boy playing football who's taken a knee during the national anthem. And I have to ask myself, I say, does that 10-year-old boy truly understand what he's taken that knee for? Or
Mhm.
did he just see this figurehead fold that piece of paper? and and that's where things have really got started to go wrong, I believe, because what is rewarded is repeated. I just I bring so many things back to my dad and back to the house that I grew up in. And like I said, I might not have. There's many times I didn't like the rules that my dad set down. You know, and I knew I'm not going to protest my dad. I'm not going to disrespect my dad. I'm just going to have to live with that. Or I use my son, my son, Chris, I use him as an example in the same way. How I raised my kids, which we had 5 of them, Lori and I together. And if we were going to change some rules in our household, or we were going to announce something big, we had family meetings. And we'd sit down, and for me, I always had put a lot of thought in those family meetings ahead of time. I try and think of things not just from my perspective, but from each kid's perspective and from the school's perspective, if they were involved, or everybody involved. I try and look at the problem or whatever we were dealing with from every perspective and make the right decision. So me thinking I'm the leader of this family. I've figured this out. These are the rules we're going to make. This is what we're going to do. We'd have a family meeting and I would sit down and say, all right, kids, new rules. This is what's been going on. This is what's going to happen. This is what the consequences that are going to, happen if you don't follow through with this, whatever. Sometimes it's not always negative. We be positive. But the point I really want to make with this is my youngest son, who's now 29 years old. He was the one that always, if he had questions or he didn't agree with something, he didn't walk away and protest and storm and go to the other kids and say, can you believe what he said? Can you believe? No, he was always very respectful. He'd raise his hand and he'd say, Dad, I have a question. Did you think about this, or what about this? And there's many, many, many times when I laid down the law in those family meetings, Chris raised his hand. He brought something up. And I'm like, you know what? He's right. Revised family plan, based on Chris's input, his quality input, his not jumping up and down and screaming or taking a knee and saying, I'm not going to respect because I respect him. Yes, I might be his father and I have that authority over him, but I respect him and I respect his opinion. And, and likewise, there's times when he brought something up and I'm like, you know what? You brought up a good point, but we're still moving forward in this direction because this is the reason why. Yeah. So it all goes back once again, I think, to how people were raised. And I do look sometimes and I think, about the family environment. I think we can probably relate a lot of the things to family environments because, whether it's broken households or kids being raised without mothers or kids being raised without fathers or kids being raised with two mothers or two fathers. And, it's a tough world to grow up in, I'm sure. And those family values are different these days.
Yeah, and it absolutely is that landscape has shifted, unfortunately, hugely. I wish it hadn't. And something you hit on there pretty heavily was love and respect seem to lead to helpful conversation. Like when you're talking about Chris raising his hand, I've got a question. You're leading through love and you're respecting them by even just calling the family meeting. Like, hey, I want to clue you in all in on the same page, allow you input. Because at the end of the day, I'm in charge. And you have the full authority and ability to say, this is what we're gonna do. No meeting, no input, no nothing. But when you lead with respect and love, and then that opens up that dialogue. And that's I don't want to just answer the question, but is it that simple? Like is it almost that in society and in the world and in our workplaces and in our families and in our homes that we need to foster a culture of love, faith, and respect, and that will lead to less disrespect, less bullying, less issues. And I want to caveat this with we're not, it's, I think a lot of times in these discussions, it can come across as pessimistic. And then the counter is always, we're not pessimistic, we're realistic. And I think that's something I kind of want to get at too here is we're not trying to dig at all the problems and focus on the problems. It's how do we make it better? Because that's where when I talk about love and respect and communication and all these things, I just see this huge breakdown of I remember when people used to say let's agree to disagree. I hear that a lot less often than I did 10, 15 years ago. Maybe that's just my biased opinion, but how is it that simple? I guess I just want to kick it back to you for your thoughts on that. Like how do we foster these relationships and these cultures that are going to lead to more respect and less disrespect and more productive conversations versus, where as we talk about preparedness and things and firearms come up and knives and lights and training and you hear this, paranoid versus prepared and all these things. How do we get away from us versus them mentalities and how do we foster this collective unity approach with love and respect and all that stuff intertwined into it?
Yeah. Respect and love, like I said, mutual respect and mutual love. It can't be a one-way street. I can't, do all of the respecting and people not respect me in return, whether it's business, family, whatever. Very similar aspect. There's so many people, they just want to be right, or and I just say, if you just calm down and think and process things through a little bit and process things from different angles, then you can it doesn't mean you have to agree, but you can at least find some mutual ground in conversation. And I'm sure I told you this story before, but somewhere around 2012 time frame when I was working in a corporate job. Part of the time they were remodeling our building, and so we had to share some office space or cubicle space with other people. and I was put in to share a one person cubicle. There was now going to be two of us in there in that office environment, and with a guy who was a professed atheist. And, I wasn't nervous about it at all, but I was just kind of thinking, I know this guy, but I'm not really friends with him. So that was probably 2012. We became good friends. We still talk on the phone at least 2 times a year, but we had a lot of very productive discussions. He would tell me his views and his thoughts, and I would tell him my views and my thoughts. But I'll go back to my prayer again too. I still always say, I want to be that light. I want to be, I want to be somebody he looks up to, even though he's older than me. I want to be that person that he looks up to. I want to be that light. And it's such a funny story because we became friends, we became good friends, and we could talk about this stuff. We could joke around with each other. He would tease me, "Hey, you're gonna go home and pray about this, right? Because that'll fix everything." And he'd try and get little jabs in, and I'd get my little jabs back. But one Christmas, he came in one day and he had a little package wrapped up, and he's like, "Wait, here you go." He goes, "I got you something for Christmas." And he was so happy. And I felt bad. I'm like, I didn't get him anything for Christmas, but he's like, "That's okay. That's okay. That's okay." He goes, and so I set it aside. And he's like, "No, no, no. You got to open it. You got to open it right now." And I didn't want to open it right then because I felt bad because I didn't get him anything. And he's
Mhm.
like, "No, no, it's okay. Open it." So I open it up and it was a Jesus nightlight. And what's so funny is we laughed about it. Both of us laughed about it. But he goes, "I was in an auto parts store and I was in there getting some washer fluid or something, and I look up in this aisle and I seen this Jesus nightlight." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's Wade. I got to get that for him for Christmas." And that's what I find so funny is I'm like, and usually our conversations when we talk a couple times a year, it's me sending him a picture of that nightlight, and I say, even in the dark, Jesus is still the light. And he'll come back, yeah, whatever, and then the phone rings, and we end up having a 2 hour conversation like you and I will. We don't agree politically, we don't believe, but he's a good person. He just he thinks differently, and my job is to love him, respect him, listen to him, and be a light for him. I'm not going to change his mind by telling him he needs to listen to me and he needs to do this. The only way I'm ever going to change his mind is to be that.
Yep. Absolutely. There's a lot there, but
Yeah.
actually the last thing you said, I wanna piggyback right off that. I'm not gonna change his mind by, pointing the finger and telling him that's to bring it into something we talk about all the time, de-escalation. I'll hit the buzzword. That's I think so much of what we talked about too, and then when you talk about a measurable, a deemed skill such as de-escalation, it really depends on those core concepts and how you treat people and the love and respect. I always say in every type of training environment that we're in talking about that, everybody gets dignity and respect no matter what. That's no matter what they did to you, no matter what they said, no matter their life circumstances, everybody gets dignity and respect, just like your cubicle mate there. And it's you find this common ground, and when we talk about de-escalation, that's one of those things where it becomes an art form quickly of how do we build rapport quickly and how do we off ramp this so it doesn't get worse and everybody involved has a better ending at the end of it, and especially verbal de-escalation. And that's where just a it's a little bit of a hard pivot here, but how do some of those concepts apply, and how do we'll hit the fun one right out of the gate is why doesn't it work when I tell somebody that's freaking out, "Calm down. Hey, calm down." Why doesn't that work? And how does even some of what we've talked about intertwine into all that? And just to hit on one measurable category there of de-escalation, what are some core tenets of that, and how do people not only like we've been talking a lot about, being a good person and a role model and stuff like that, but then how do you bring all those concepts and those core beliefs into a de-escalation environment where the temperature has gone up, even if it's family Thanksgiving and Uncle Jimmy's all jazzed up about the election again, or somebody at the gas station is mad that I was going 54 and a 55 and they want to let me know, like, how do I apply some of these dignity, respect, love, faith, human interaction, how do I apply that in that context to make sure that I don't get myself into a bad situation, but also still at the same time, that's the other opportunity there is to shine that light on those individuals we're interacting with. What are some of your takes on that?
Yeah, that's tough. That's probably one of the toughest things you've asked me that I don't have an answer. It just goes back again to be a good person. Well, I guess where my mind just immediately went was something that I've told you about. I don't think I ever really read it to you, but I had to put in my mind in 2012 timeframe again. Obviously, being a firearms instructor and being a concealed pistol license holder way back prior to 2012, I think I got my license in 2008. So I've been carrying a firearm for a very, very long time. And you've heard me teach in the class that the very first few times I started to carry a firearm, I felt really uncomfortable because I was raised in an environment where I was taught gun safety. I was taught certain things about firearms, but I was taught that you never carry a firearm in public, let alone a loaded firearm. My dad and I are going hunting. The gun has to be unloaded in a case, stored in the back seat. We go to our hunting spot. Many times my dad would not even let me load the firearm until I was setting in my spot that I was going to be hunting because he didn't want me walking across the field with a loaded firearm at a young age. He was overly cautious with some of that stuff, but I thank him for that. So, but when I look at being a firearm instructor, and so when I first got my concealed pistol license, I felt really uncomfortable because I'm now stepping outside of the comfort level of how I was raised and those family values and those lessons that my dad taught me. I'm going against them because now I'm carrying a loaded firearm in public where I used to not even be able to carry a loaded firearm across the field to my hunting spot. So I felt uncomfortable and I didn't like that feeling of feeling uncomfortable. So how are you going to get uncomfortable? You're going to get more training and you're going to get more practice. And eventually the comfort level is going to come. So between 2008 and 2012, I carried a firearm occasional, but still not every day like I do today and every day. But in 2012, a life-changing event took place, and that was Sandy Hook mass shooting. And when I saw the pictures of those innocent grade school kids killed, it hurt me. It just hurt me like it hurt everybody, I'm sure. But I had to build a mindset into my mind right then and I had to put it on paper. So not only in my mind, but I had to put it on paper so that I could comprehend and understand my emotion and what I was feeling. And the conclusion that I read, some of the conclusions I really came to was that there's good in this world, but there's certainly evil in this world. I like to think that if we compare the two, that the good far outweighs the evil, but reality is there is still evil in this world. So, my vow, and that's what I wrote was my vow. Um, I, vow to love and respect all people, regardless of their race, color, religion, creed, anything. Any random person that I see on the street, I will treat them with respect as long as they treat me with respect. I will mind my own business. I will do my own thing, but make no mistake. If you threaten the life of me or my family or a loved one or, most anybody within my circle, I will not hesitate to use every force necessary to resolve that issue. And I really had to put that in my mind. And then I've pretty much carried a firearm every single day since then. And I've never, ever had to expose my firearm, draw my firearm. And, and I'm certainly happy with that. Uh, Another little story. I don't always share this, but along the lines of the firearm and having it and not having it mindset. I had in the state of Michigan an exempt CPL for a very long time, which anybody who doesn't know what an exempt CPL means that I'm due to law enforcement and security license and different things, I was exempt from the typical pistol-free zones or gun-free zones that the state of Michigan set out
Mhm.
with. So, schools, daycare centers, things like that, where the average people cannot carry in there, I could legally carry, and with that exemption. And so I was going to go to a school event one day. It was actually a Veterans Day celebration, and I was carrying my firearm as I always do. I've been to this veterans celebration many years. I pulled in the parking lot. I took my firearm off and I locked it in the safe that was in my truck because I know I was going into the school. Even though I'm legal to carry in there, I didn't necessarily feel comfortable. And I started to walk into the school, and then I thought at the time, I still had two kids in that school. And I said to myself, wait a minute, go back and get the firearm and put it on and go in. And the reason being, because I thought, where do the bad things happen? First of all, most of the bad things happen in these pistol-free zones where the mass shootings take place, where people can't protect themselves. And I thought, if I walk into that school and anything should happen, God forbid, there's two people, my two kids, that are sitting in there, and they would immediately feel like Dad's got this under control. And if something happened to my kids or anybody else in that whole school or that whole veterans celebration, my kids would be asking me the question, Dad, why did you leave your firearm in the car? And, you know, to me, I was like, that's enough for me. I put the firearm back in, I went in, and the point of that being, people, for years I did that. Nobody ever knew I had a firearm, and my kids knew, but they also knew. It was like, you don't ever tell anybody that you don't tell them what I do. Even though I'm legal, you just don't say it. And thank goodness they did. But yeah, I guess it goes back to that mindset of having to put in my mind that there's good, there's evil, and I will respect everybody, but I will protect as well.
Yeah, and
And
I definitely wanna hit on mindset before we wind down here because that's something I've
it's,
always
it's
admired your take on that. We haven't gotten too much into, gym ownership and your MMA background and I know we've mentioned the military and Trinity and all those things. In all not all, but in yeah, probably all the things you've done, you've always had this mindset of, like you said, "I'm gonna do it, and if it doesn't work, I'm gonna fix it, and I'm gonna continue to do it. I'm not gonna quit. I'm gonna continue pushing through, and I'm gonna make it work. I'm gonna make adjustments, kind of adapt, and then continue." And so you have some really interesting articulations of mindset and some stories, and we could probably talk for hours on this, but would you mind cracking that can open a little bit on mindset and your thoughts on mindsets people should instill within themselves and yeah, whichever direction you think.
Gosh, there's a lot of little. I'm a big analogy person or a big story person, and yeah, I'm really big on if something doesn't work, I'm always if something doesn't go as planned, why didn't it go as planned, and how can we correct that, and how can we push through? One of I don't remember when I ever read this first quote, but we all like sometimes you find really good ones, but I know for sure I think I was in middle school somewhere and I read this quote and it stood out to me where I still remember it to this day. Obstacles are things a person sees when they take their mind off their goal.
Mm.
And I don't know who wrote it. I just remember reading that, and it was so impactful to me to think, if you have a goal, basically don't look at those obstacles in the way, or you're going to run over those obstacles. And there's so many stories that I could tell you about that, but I tried to carry those over into our fitness classes or our MMA classes or CPL classes and that mindset when we're doing a workout, I try and bring out the best in everybody. And it's not, I'm going to be better than you. I'm going to run faster than you. If I do run faster than you, Trevor, I'm going to be turning around and I'm going to be giving you crap saying, come on, step it up, guy, get me out, let's go. That's what I like. I like the competition of I don't want to run out in front all by myself. I want you pushing me, and if you pass me, all right, what am I going to do now? I don't expect you to continue forging on ahead either. You're going to be turning around and saying, now look who's ahead, buddy. You
Mhm.
know, that's what builds good mindset and competition. I think of this one too, and I told this a lot because we ran some seriously intense workouts. We've had a lot of we call them pukers. We used to kind of laugh at that a little bit when new people had come in, especially in the MMA world. Um, we joked around a little bit that with no disrespect, if a person walked through the door and said, "Hey, I want to fight," we always learned typically there's some sort of underlying issue in their life. They broke up with their girlfriend, they got kicked out of the house, they got something and they're angry. And anger does not carry over into effective fighting in any aspect, really. So, if that person walked through the door, we would purposely run them through the ringer. We were going to beat them up. And but with respect, we were going to tell them we were glad they were there. And we were going to, whatever they did, we were going, and because we didn't want that person with an anger issue coming in and thinking that they were better than any of us, because then they would feel like that anger won. So we've got to put that anger in check. And if I couldn't do it, there was always somebody in the gym that could, for sure. It's just the way it is. I've been with a lot of pro level MMA fighters, boxers, collegiate wrestlers, and things that, like I said, if I can't do it, but we would take that person that came in with anger issues, and we would first, um, we've got to humble them. We've got to make them feel like they're not who they think they are. We would do it to a level where when they left, one of two things was going to happen. We were never going to see that person again in our lives, or they were going to become part of our circle for life. That's the only two outcomes possible, because they realize what they stepped into in that world, and it's a brotherhood of people um, who care a lot about each other. We care a lot about each other, everybody's families, and we, as this, sayings go, blood, sweat, and tears. We've done it all together, and we'll welcome you into that world if you're going to be a respectful part of that world.
Mhm.
But we're going to be a level above you. We're going to show you that my term was, we've got to show them who the dominant male is. And nobody is going to walk in that gym off from the street and be the dominant male. It never happened, ever, once. We had some tough people walk in there, but somebody is going to be a dominant over that person. Nobody ever walked in with the chip on their shoulder and at a dominant level. So we got to put that in check and show them who the dominance is. And then, like I said, they're going to blend right in and train, or they're going to, we're never going to see them again, because they're going to walk away thinking, holy crap, I didn't know what I was getting myself into.
Right.
Along that mindset of, oh, I kind of went down that rabbit trail. We did some very tough workouts, things where people thought, I can't do this. And my job was always to help them, bring them on to, you can do this. Um, One of the stories, we used to do just so many things in the workout, but when I would have people puking or crying, and sometimes ladies were in the class too, and I would try and encourage them, and they're broken, they can't continue, they can't keep going on in this workout, I can't finish it. And then I've stopped workouts before, and I've told them, Marcus Luttrell was the lone survivor in Afghanistan, Operation Red Wing. Long story if anybody knows that. But Marcus watched all of his teammates, Navy SEALs and higher level people killed in action. He's the only one left, and he's been shot. He's fell off a mountain, broke his back, bit his tongue off, all of these horrible things. And I watched this little video clip of him saying where he climbed in this crevice of a mountain, and he's like, I was hurting bad. You know, he bit his tongue off, back broken, shot, stab, you know, whatever, everything. He goes, I was dying. He fell asleep and he woke up and he still said, you know, I'm dying. What am I going to do? You know, all my teammates are dead. How am I going to get out of this? He said he took a rock and he drew a line in the dirt and he told himself, I'm going to crawl past that line. And if I make it past that line, I'm going to do it again. He said, well, he made it past that line and he did it again and he did it again for 7 miles.
Hmm.
So, you know, and he's the lone survivor. So, as a person's laying on my wrestling mat, feeling defeated, feeling like they can't crawl down to the end of that mat, I tell them, you know, draw that line in that sand, and you can make it past that point because if Marcus Luttrell can do it for 7 miles after he bit his tongue off and swallowed it and threw it back up and broke his back and you know all of these things, you're telling me you can't make it to the end of that wrestling mat? And people will get back up and they'll go. Um, you know, or another story we were talking about earlier was the sled that we used. And I told you we used to push back and forth. It's a weighted sled, or it had a mechanical mechanism inside of there that would give resistance, and we could put weight on there. And it is very difficult to push it down and back on that wrestling mat. But it also had a rope on it, and two kinds of people again. You know, as a person struggling and pushing that down and they're going away from me and they're pushing that sled down to the end of the mat, once in a while I would like to grab that rope and stop it. And occasionally when I pull on that rope to stop them from pushing that sled, the person stops and turns around and they're like, come on, man, what are you doing? You know? And I said, that's not the mindset we want. The mindset that we want is, you know, I'm pulling that rope and you're still going to overcome that obstacle. Back to my quote, obstacles are things a person sees when they take their mind off their goal. So, you know, don't turn around and look at me and say, quit pulling on the rope. Fight me for it. Do you want that warrior mindset? What do you want to do?
Yeah.
So,
Push through, make it work.
yes,
Yeah.
man, I feel like I just spew a lot of stuff when you ask a question.
No, it's all and it's all great stuff, and it's you're definitely not spewing. It's there's so many things you said that I wanna take us down a 5-hour journey, but I probably shouldn't. So are there any last parting thoughts, things we haven't dug into at all that you wanna bring up? Any as we kinda wind down here?
No, I feel like you've really, as you ask those questions, it forces me to dig back and think. And like I said, I have struggles still too, just lifestyle change struggles now. It's hard for me to not live in that world that I used to live in so many ways. And I try and you got to have a purpose and a goal. And without a purpose and without a goal, you tend to not train. You tend not to flourish, if you will.
Yeah, that's I think that really sums up a lot of things we talked about is, purpose and the goal, and then especially what you're hitting on at the end there with the MMA stuff and the individual that comes in, discipline. Because that was the word that I thought about a lot when you were talking about that, is when somebody comes in, maybe they're angry, like you said, maybe they're 18 years old and in very good shape, very motivated, just naturally athletic like 18-year-olds are. But the thing they don't have is they don't have discipline, they don't have direction, they have all this energy and this horsepower, but they have no proper channel for that energy and that horsepower, and discipline is that once you have a purpose and discipline and a goal, that's where you have the opportunity for success in those things. And but yeah, thank you very much for being here, Wade. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time and everything we talked about. We'll wrap
Well,
this up and maybe have some deeper future discussions. Thank you very much.
yeah, no, thank you very much for the opportunity, and the opportunity to share. Just appreciate it very much as well. Appreciate everything you do.
You as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Prepared to Prevail. Please visit preparedtoprevail.com for more resources and educational materials.